Ahead of the recent EU elections, it was confidently predicted that big gains would be made on the furthest reaches of the conservative spectrum, from the hard right to the far right to the ultra-right to the just plain howling at the moon. So it came pretty much to pass. The far right did especially well in Austria, France, Italy and Germany, all countries which it might have been hoped had learned, and the hard way, a few lessons over the years about the perils of encouraging seething nationalists. It is probably not prudent to panic over much about EU elections. Turnout is usually low, and it was just 51% this time. Voters often see them as a free swing at their incumbent national government. In Germany in particular, the parties which currently comprise the coalition in charge did notably badly. But voting for the far right is no longer just a protest. The far right has governed in Poland, is governing in Italy and sort of governing in the Netherlands. And the degree to which the far right bounce in this EU election does matter was illustrated by the response of French President Emmanuel Macron. Faced with the national rally of his twice-defeated presidential election opponent Marine Le Pen, jumping from 18 seats in the EU Parliament to 30, Macron dissolved France's National Assembly and called a snap election. In so doing, he has asked France's and perhaps Europe's people, is this really what you want? Has President Macron figured out how to corral the populist far right? If he or anyone else hasn't, to what degree should the far right be engaged with? And are far right parties forced to change once in power? This is the Foreign Desk.
I think what he's really up to here is trying to work out, are people fed up? Are they voting for the far right because it's a sort of midterm voter protest? Or do people really think that they would be better at running the country? I think that's the way Macron's sort of thinking this through.
Only now Meloni is getting closer to Le Pen because she really wants to be a model for other European far-right parties, for a kind of normalization and to transform these forces in forces that can govern and show the world that the hard right can be a trustful partner in government also for other allies.
Instead of changing the centre ground of Polish politics as they had with social policy, their attempts in particular to use Poland's EU membership and European integration more generally as a wedge issue had a different effect. And the more that they pushed in particular against Europe, the more that they found that actually a fairly large and stubborn majority of Poles are strongly pro-European and strongly pro-integration.
You're listening to the Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller. First, we'll hear from the former president of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso. Barroso spoke to Monocle's Carlotta Rebello earlier this week in Milan, and she got his reaction to those EU election results.
And if you take the three most important pro-European parties, DPP plus the Social Democrats and the Liberals, they continue to have a majority in the parliament. So let's put things in the right context and not create alarmism. Of course, I know that it sells more. Pessimism or catastrophic views sell more than measured, rational, reasonable analysis. But I'm trying to be intellectually honest. Having said that, yes, there is a rise of some extremes, namely from the so-called far right, even if I do not agree with putting all those parties in the same basket. Some of them, for instance, here in Italy, it's a party that sometimes is qualified as far right or even called post-fascist. But it's a party that basically in European terms is playing by the rules, and it is voting with the mainstream parties. So I don't agree that we are systematically calling extremes those who don't like. On the contrary, we have to try to understand what is behind that vote. Because all votes of every citizen are legitimate. I repeat, I'm not on those parties, I'm a centrist, but I have to understand the concerns that make people vote increasingly for those populistic parties. And some of those concerns may be legitimate. So I think there is an opportunity for a recalibration in Europe. It means for the political elites to take in consideration concerns of the common people. And I believe the centrist parties, from the center right to the center left, will be wise enough to do it, so that there will continue to be, overall, strong support for the European Union. We cannot only have some part of the left or a cozy arrangement only between some center parties.
That was former European Commission President Jose Manuel Barroso speaking to Monocle's Carlotta Rebello. This is the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio, and I'm joined now from a currently politically roiling Paris by Sophie Pedder, author of Révolution Française, Emmanuel Macron and the Quest to Reinvent a Nation. Sophie, first of all, President Macron gave a press conference this week explaining his decision to call an election a little bit further. Has anybody asked Macron whether there weren't perhaps less dramatic options available? I know that the President of the National Assembly, Yael Braun-Pivet, said that it didn't have to be like this.
Yes, I think that there is a feeling among several members of his own party that this wasn't necessary, not at this moment. What Macron has argued is that because of this parliamentary deadlock and with the prospect in September of him having to put a budget to Parliament that then might be rejected, and even to a point where there was a no confidence motion called and then his government might fall anyway, that it was something he wanted to. The word he keeps using is clarify. He wants to clarify this moment. I think what he's really up to here is trying to work out, are people fed up? Are they voting for the far right because it's a sort of midterm voter protest? Or do people really think that they would be better at running the country? I think that's the way Macron's sort of thinking this through. And his feeling was, yes, OK, there could have been other options, maybe he's waiting until September and then being forced into it. But at least this way he chooses the moment, and that this clarification, which is what he calls it, can be made up front. Not everyone in his party agrees with that, but that's the way he decides. He's not someone who likes to be backed into a corner and to take decisions sort of against his will. He likes to have control of the timing of things, of the calendar, of the electoral diary, and that is very much come out in the way he answered questions at the press conference this week.
If it turns out he's wrong, and it turns out that the National Rally do win this election much as they did very, very well in the EU elections, do we have any idea what that would look like? What would a National Rally government under President Macron want to do, and what would they actually be able to do?
I mean, even just hearing you ask that question is it makes one kind of double take. Look, the polls suggest it's not just a possibility that the National Rally will do well, but that it's a probability that, they could even triple the number of seats. They currently have 88 in Parliament out of 577. They could triple that. It's unlikely that they could get a majority by themselves, but even if they were the single biggest party, which is not out of the question, they could end up being in a position to try and form a coalition that could then form a government. So this is where we are. They have the dynamic with them. What would it then look like? Well, Marine Le Pen, who's still sort of in charge of her party, although she doesn't nominally hold that title as president, she says she wants to put forward as Prime Minister Jordan Bardella. This is the 28-year-old leader of her party. He was the head of the list for the European elections. He is very popular among young people. He's very present on TikTok. He's a kind of presentable-looking guy that people seem to feel they can relate to. And he is the person with no experience of governing anything or even running anything except that party is the person she would put forward to run the government. After that, it's anyone's guess. This is not a party that was ready to take over now. They have been preparing for 2027, which is the next presidential election. And that they have been doing some pretty detailed work on sort of policies, but they were not preparing to put forward lists of ministers for a government in June 2024.
If it turns out that they are in a position to form a government but need coalition allies to do it, will there be any available? There has been across European politics for the last few years this idea of a cordon sanitaire, that respectable political parties simply will not deal with people who are right-wing past a certain point. We've certainly seen vows of that sort expressed at various times in Germany and the Netherlands. Or would there be people willing to put their reservations to one side and engage with the National Rally?
Well, we've already seen this begin to happen. We've had the head of the Republicans, that's the main centre-right party. It's the party that's the inheritor of the sort of Gaullist right. The head of that party, Eric Ciotti, has this week said that he wants the party to team up with the National Rally. Now, that is broken a taboo in his party. Many of his colleagues are absolutely furious. The party is ejecting him. A lot of this is in flux, but I think what it points to is a potential for Marine Le Pen's party to sort of reach out to individuals, if not parties, in order to try and form that kind of coalition. I mean, if you think about it, ever since 2017, when Macron was first elected and he kind of blew up the parliamentary party system, there's been a lot of fluidity between parties. There's a lot of kind of blurring of boundaries, people jumping from one side to another. And I think that you're going to potentially see quite a lot of that, either before the lists have to be drawn up on the 16th of June or after the first round, or even after the final results on July 7th, when those sorts of coalition talks might happen. So I do think that in France, we've seen that cordon sanitaire being already dismantled in this week, even before the elections have taken place.
To bring this back then to what Macron's strategy might be and to the theme of this episode, is there part of him hoping that either he calls France's bluff now and they decide that on sober reflection they don't actually want to be governed by the National Rally, and or is he hoping that if they decide they do want to be governed by the National Rally prove, as populists very often do, completely incapable of actually governing?
I think that is possibly part of his calculation. There is the idea that if they are in power for the next period ahead of the 2027 election, it's a question perhaps both of incompetence or competence and of having to make the kind of compromises that government involves that are much easier to ignore or to sort of deny when you're just engaged in populist sloganeering. When you're actually in government, you have to make choices, you have to make compromises, and that can actually weaken your support among voters. So there is the theory that is part of what Macron is looking at, potentially undermining the National Rally by accepting perhaps that it will have to govern at some point, and better do that now and then show up its weaknesses or its shortcomings and then undermine it ahead of the presidential election, when a victory there at that election would be a much more serious one for France.
Sophie Pedder, thank you. That was President Emmanuel Macron's biographer, Sophie Pedder. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. To Italy now, and I'm joined from Milan by Marilisa Palumbo, foreign editor of Corriere della Sera. Marilisa, first of all, as this episode goes to air, Giorgia Meloni is hosting the G7. She's at the top of a table surrounded by presidents and prime ministers, many of whom, at least back home where they govern, would not have touched a party like hers with a barge pole. So I guess the question is, are we already seeing that the far right is becoming normalised?
For sure it is, and I can tell you that already in Italy we are not talking about Meloni as far right anymore. So that's one thing. And the other thing, you were mentioning the G7, and actually she is the only strong leader in a table of ghost leaders at the moment, because you have Macron, of course, who lost the European election and had to call for new elections, a new parliamentary election that risks putting Marine Le Pen in power for the first time. You have Scholz, who is very weak. I think he got 14%, something like that. And then Biden is struggling to get reelected. The polls are not nice. So Meloni is the only leader at that table that had a successful European election. She did even better than on the parliamentary election 2 years ago, which is quite rare, for a sitting head of government. She took almost 29% of the votes, compared with 25 in 2022.
When you say she's not regarded as far right in Italy anymore, has she changed at all since coming to power, or has she maybe changed Italy's political spectrum?
I think both are true. For sure, I think even this election, for example, have stated that the Brothers of Italy, her party, is now Giorgia's party, Giorgia's Meloni's party, because she took 2.5 million personal votes, which is a huge number. And she even invited the Italians to write her name, Giorgia. So there are no other important figures in the party. It's her party, and it's her personality that comes across as not frightening. So on the one hand, she has made this image of herself as a very pragmatic, practical leader, well respected on the international stage because she has aligned herself with the Western leaders. So she's not like other far-right leaders in Europe that, for example, don't want to support Ukraine or are close to Russia. So she's very, very close to Biden. She's aligned with European and NATO allies. And on the other hand, she is using a rhetoric at home where she's pushing for some issues that are important to her voters. For example, abortion or LGBT rights. And so she has a stronger hard-right propaganda on that level, but that's not something that really preoccupies, I think, until now, the external allies.
Which does prompt the question of what she actually believes and what she thinks is expedient. You're right to point out that a lot of other European leaders were pleasantly surprised by how solid she proved to be on Ukraine, especially given that she contains within her coalition some out-and-out Vladimir Putin fanboys, in the League in particular. Do you think her heart is in the Ukraine issue, or is that just something she thought, if I toe the line on this, that will give me enough cover of respectability that I can get away with everything else?
That's a very hard question because I'm not in her heart and not in her mind. But I think that she has changed a little bit, having to deal with other leaders, having to deal with Zelensky. I think she has changed a little bit on Ukraine, sincerely. On the other hand, she's very smart and pragmatic, as I said, and she knows that the only way to be strong on the international stage and stay in power and not have, powerful allies against you is to not move from that line that was settled before her and that all European allies are following, which is, support Ukraine. Even if I have to say there are differences. For example, recently, most of the other countries, Britain, France, the United States, have said that Ukraine is allowed to use Western weapons to strike inside Russian territory. And that was something that the Italian government does not agree on. So that's a little change. She was also, I think, during the electoral campaign, so she had to water down a little bit, to find the right balance between supporting Ukraine and talk to a public opinion that it's getting, as everywhere else, unfortunately in Europe and in US, a little bit wary of the war efforts.
It has been suggested that Marine Le Pen, who still wants to be president of France, regards Giorgia Meloni as a model. And we're talking elsewhere in the programme about other ideas and other templates that might be exported from one situation to another. But when you look at how Giorgia Meloni won power and how she has exercised it, is there possibly a model there for how other far-right politicians or other politicians characterised as far-right politicians might actually be able to accomplish more than they usually accomplish, which is just making a noise?
It's very interesting that you are making a comparison with Marine Le Pen, because I was thinking that Marine Le Pen has tried for years a process similar to Meloni's, the so-called dédiabolisation, in French, becoming not evil, is something that she's been making for years, and she has not completely succeeded until now. And for Meloni, it took a much shorter time. So for sure, she can be a model for Marine Le Pen. But the relationship between the two, it's not that easy, because as you probably know, Marine Le Pen was and is primarily an ally of Salvini, also in the European group of identity and democracy. And only now Meloni is getting closer to Le Pen because she really wants to be a model for other European far-right parties for a kind of normalization and to transform these forces in forces that can govern and show the world that the hard right can be a trustful partner in government also for other allies. But it won't be easy because there are so many different rights in Europe, and they have profound differences regarding Ukraine, regarding civil rights. So I think that Meloni knows that she's at the moment maybe the stronger leader in Europe because of the results of the European election. So she's gonna play that card as well as she can, and she's gonna try to make like a family of hard right parties. But that task, I think it will be very, very difficult.
We started out this episode talking about the EU elections and how they have slightly shifted the political landscape in the European Union. Do we think Giorgia Meloni at this point might be a bit reluctant to be tied to Marine Le Pen or associated to Marine Le Pen because she would much rather be seen as a palatable partner by someone like Ursula von der Leyen?
Yes, that's, the hard balance that she has to find, because on the one hand, as I said, she has become closer to Marine Le Pen, but on the other hand, she has, for example, during the electoral campaign, she has been with Ursula von der Leyen, and Ursula von der Leyen has traveled to Italy many times. So, of course, there is a connection there, and she wants to play a part in Ursula von der Leyen re-election, even if she can't be on the majority, because you have the Socialist Party that will never accept an official endorsement of Ursula von der Leyen in the majority. So she will probably support von der Leyen for sure. We think in the dinner of the head of government and states Monday, 17th of June, and then she will probably tell her party to vote for Ursula von der Leyen, but she will ask something. She will ask for a very powerful commissioner for Italy. So I think she will try to support von der Leyen, but she will ask for something.
Marilisa Palumbo at Corriere della Sera, thank you for joining us. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller. Poland furnishes a useful case study in how the nationalist populist right can gain and hold office and how they can be ejected from it. Last October, the Law and Justice Party, or PIS, lost a Polish election after nearly a decade in charge, and lost it at that to a coalition led by archetypal pro-EU liberal former Prime Minister Donald Tusk, now Prime Minister again. I'm joined now by Ben Stanley, Associate Professor at the Centre for the Study of Democracy at SWPS University of Social Sciences and Humanities in Warsaw. Ben, let's go back to when PIS, or Law and Justice, were actually in charge. At that point, where was their balance between the culture war stuff and actually governing?
Well, the culture war stuff was an important part of what Law and Justice were trying to do. I mean, one of their key objectives in governing was to essentially pursue a very different cultural model to that which had sort of held sway since 1989. So in essence, it was an intrinsic part of their political appeal and an intrinsic part of what they were doing as a party in power. And aside from being a sort of an ideological set of objectives, it was also a mode of governance, a way of discrediting certain opponents to their ideology, both in the media and in among political parties. So it was a way in which they could use issues such as LGBT plus rights and the issue of abortion in particular to drive wedges between sections of the electorate, and also to try to push opposition parties into more liberal positions and thereby increase polarization. So it was both ideology and a sort of a pragmatic tool of governance.
But as a government, did they actually get anything done? Because the common, somewhat wishful hope often applied to populists is that let them get in charge for a few years, make it clear that they can't fill in the potholes or collect the bins, and everybody will get sick of them. But did they actually do the basic functions of government at all competently?
Well, this is one of the reasons why they lasted as long as they did. I mean, one of the questions that I was asked in the early years of their term in office was, how are these guys actually, how did they get into power in the first place? And having got into power, why do they still have so much support? There was this sort of expectation that a populist party that had come to power on this lurid critique of the politics of transition was going to rapidly come unstuck when it came to the actual sort of bread and butter stuff of making sure that the bins were empty and that the trains ran on time. And yet this was a party that made clear promises during the electoral campaign in 2015, such as increasing child benefit, decreasing the retirement age, got elected on a slim majority, but enough to give them a decent cushion for governing, and then went ahead and implemented these changes, despite having been told by all manner of observers, opposition parties and independent observers, economists, and policy specialists, that this sort of stuff was going to be impossible to introduce, that the child benefit would end up capsizing the budget, and that administratively Poland simply wasn't capable of introducing these kinds of reforms. What they did is they got elected and actually delivered on some of their key promises, which is more than can be said for some of their previous non-populist predecessors. So I think in that sense, they proved fairly early on that they were capable of delivering on at least some of their promises. When they came unstuck was not so much as a result of their populism itself, but for many of the same reasons that two-term governments come unstuck. The public starts to get tired of them. They start to run out of ideas. They start to have sort of a degree of the arrogance of power and the complacency of power creeping in. So what Law and Justice has shown during their period in office is that in many respects, populist parties in government may simply act in ways which are pretty similar to the kinds of the ways in which their non-populist counterparts act. This idea that they are inevitably fated to drop the ball when in office seems to have been overturned by examples like these.
Well, when we think then about how Donald Tusk and the Civic Coalition beat them, is it possible that PIS misjudged how potent Europe and the EU was as a wedge issue? Because we've seen populists across the continent, most famously here in the United Kingdom, successfully using that as a wedge issue. And PIS did pick fights with the EU, much as Hungary does now. But did they find out to their cost that there's actually perhaps more affection for the EU than they imagined?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that was quite clear to them, certainly in their first term in office, is that they could shift the needle on certain questions like social policy, for example. And I think that their assumption was that what had worked for them there on an issue like how interventionist the state should be and how egalitarian we should aim to be as a society, that if it could shift the needle on those issues, it would be able to do the same for some of the culture war stuff and also the issue of Europe. And this is really where they came unstuck. Instead of changing the center ground of Polish politics as they had with social policy, their attempts to push these culture war issues and in particular to use Poland's EU membership and European integration more generally as a wedge issue had a different effect. It ended up having a polarizing impact rather than a unifying one. And the more that they pushed in particular against Europe, the more that they found that actually a fairly large and stubborn majority of Poles are strongly pro-European and strongly pro-integration and didn't really buy this narrative that they were trying to push of Poland as a second-class partner in Europe. Rather, there was the response that they had from the electorate in 2023 was a pushback against this idea that Poland should turn away entirely from this sort of liberal democratic orthodoxy that had held sway since 1989 and pursue a different model of development. While the electorate was willing to go along in some respects with revisions to this model, such as in the area of social policy, it turned out that actually a rather substantial proportion of voters were not keen on moving to an entirely different model of development and moving away from the European mainstream.
Is there then anything exportable from how the Civic Coalition was able to defeat PIS? And this is obviously despite the PIS's many years of attempting to make that impossible by indulging in a regime of state capture, trying to, suborn the judiciary and the media and all the other things that are supposed to be bulwarks against authoritarianism. The PIS did all that and still lost. Is it just as simple as remembering that usually the urban dwellers and the younger folk, who tend to be a bit more resistant to conservative populism in particular, do have the numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's an element of that, particularly given the rise that we saw in turnout in the election, which was something in the order of 74%. One of the things that Law and Justice did, sort of almost paradoxically in a way, is that through their populism, they almost led to a kind of revival of democracy, in the sense that they galvanized the other side as well as their own. The turnout that we saw in the last election was a sign that the electorate was not willing in its entirety to swallow a lot of what Law and Justice has been doing over the last 8 years. And one of the things that the opposition did reasonably effectively was to try to amalgamate some of the various concerns that various political parties and ideological movements had about Law and Justice's time in office into a sort of relatively homogeneous and coherent critique of democratic backsliding. I mean, they positioned themselves very much as the pro-democratic alternative. And I think that worked for them in an electoral sense. It remains to be seen, though, whether now in power, that kind of forced homogeneity can actually hold. One of the problems they're experiencing currently is that they run the gamut from some very sort of conservative figures, many of whom could actually be in Law and Justice themselves, well across to sort of some fairly orthodox social democrats and even a sprinkling of socialists. So holding it together now that they're in power is going to be more of a challenge. But putting together those pro-democratic coalitions and making compromises on the various elements of a broad political agenda that coalition is willing to pursue is one way of defeating populism. One of the things that, say, Viktor Orban in Hungary has been able to benefit from is the fact that the opposition has been so disparate and so disorganized. That wasn't the case in Poland.
Ben Stanley, thank you for joining us on the Foreign Desk. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Christy O'Grady. Christy also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. Thanks also this episode to Carlotta Rebello. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email chris@cc@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.